The door creaked open slowly, a sound that felt more like an old memory trying to escape. Inside, the dim lights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the cold concrete floor. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of rusted metal and old dog fur. Silence hung thick, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. It was a place that had once been full of life, full of purpose, but now it seemed like the forgotten corner of a world that had moved on. Captain John, Jack Harper, stepped into the room, his boots echoing against the bare walls. He wasn't sure what he expected to find here, but he wasn't prepared for what he saw. His uniform, crisp and clean, didn't match the man who wore it. Jack had changed. The war had left its marks on him, in ways no one could see. His face, once full of life, now seemed etched with a quiet sadness. Years of combat, of loss, had taken something from him, something he wasn't sure he could ever get back. He stood still for a moment, allowing the memories to wash over him. The long nights in the desert, the noise of gunfire and explosions, the fear of what might come next. But then, from the far corner of the room, something caught his eye. Behind a steel gate stood a dog, an older German shepherd, gray around the muzzle, his eyes still sharp, still filled with something that Jack could never forget. Rocco, his partner, his best friend. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen Rocco in years. The last time they were together, they were in Kandahar, facing down an enemy that would do anything to destroy them. The last time he saw Rocco, the dog had been badly injured, bloodied and limp, but still alive, still fighting. After the explosion, they had been separated. Jack was sent home, and Rocco was taken somewhere far away. The military had told him they would not update him on Rocco's status. It was cold. It was impersonal. But it felt like they were taking away the one thing that kept him grounded. Jack had never gotten over losing Rocco, even though he tried to bury it deep inside. But here he was, standing in front of the dog he thought he had lost forever. Rocco didn't move at first. His eyes, still sharp, locked onto Jack's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jack could see the dog's muscles tense, as if trying to decide whether to approach or to turn away. Then, slowly, Rocco stepped forward. Not hesitantly, but with purpose. His tail didn't wag. There was no excitement, no jumping up in joy. It was as if the dog was trying to hold onto something deeper. A memory, perhaps, that had been buried in the dark corners of both their hearts. Jack fell to his knees. He didn't care that the men around him, other soldiers, were watching. He didn't care about anything except the moment unfolding before him. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he couldn't stop them. They came, one after another, as memories rushed back. The good times, the bad times, the times when Rocco had been the only one who understood. "You remember me," Jack whispered, his voice shaky. "My God, you remember me." And then Rocco let out a low, soft whine, his tail twitching just slightly, as if to say, "Of course, I remember you." It wasn't just a sound. It wasn't just a simple noise. It was everything they had been through together, everything they had survived. In that moment, all the pain, all the distance between them, seemed to vanish. It was just the two of them again. Soldier and dog, partner and friend, and nothing else mattered. The other soldiers watched in silence, their faces a mixture of admiration and sorrow. They had seen this before, but it never got easier. The bond between man and dog was something that went beyond words, beyond duty. It was something pure, something that couldn't be broken, not even by time, not even by war. Jack stood up slowly, his hand reaching out to Rocco, who stepped forward, his body pressing against Jack's, as if reminding him that nothing had changed. Jack wrapped his arms around Rocco's thick neck, holding him tightly, like a lifeline. "You're here," Jack said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're really here." Rocco let out a sharp breath, pressing his head into Jack's shoulder. It was a moment of comfort, of connection. And in that moment, Jack realized that the years of separation, the years of pain, had not broken their bond. It had only made it stronger. As Jack held Rocco, he realized something else, something that had been gnawing at him since he first stepped into the room. Rocco wasn't just here for the reunion. There was something else, something deep inside the dog's eyes that told Jack they weren't done. The past wasn't finished with them yet. The soldiers around them stood at attention, their faces set in the stoic, disciplined masks they had worn for years. But there was a shift in the air, a weight that no one spoke of. Something had changed. The world outside this room was still the same, dangerous, unpredictable. But for a moment, in that small space, Jack and Rocco had found each other again. And now, as they stood together, Jack couldn't help but feel a new wave of fear creeping into his heart. Rocco had been through more than he could ever know. And there were things, dark things, that neither of them were ready to face. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. And that was enough. As the days passed, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The reunion with Rocco had been everything he had hoped for, yet something lingered in the back of his mind, a nagging sensation that refused to let go. Despite the warmth of their reconnection, Jack felt as though the shadows that had followed him from the war were creeping back into his life. And they weren't just his shadows, they were Rocco's too. That night, after the kennel had quieted and the soldiers had retreated to their bunks, Jack lay awake, staring up at the cracked ceiling. The faint sound of Rocco's breathing filled the silence, a reminder that he was no longer alone in the world. The dog was curled up at the foot of the bed, his large, muscular body still intense. Jack's gaze shifted to Rocco's furrowed brow, his ears twitching at sounds Jack couldn't hear. It wasn't sleep. Rocco wasn't resting. He was alert, watching, waiting. Jack's thoughts raced as he watched the dog. Rocco had been through so much, more than Jack could imagine. The explosion in Kandahar, the battles that followed, the separation. It had all left its mark on the dog. Jack had always known that, but it was only now, as he looked at Rocco, that he realized how much the dog had suffered. Rocco had survived just like he had, but at what cost? "Hey boy," Jack whispered, his voice low and gentle. "What happened to you when we were apart? What did they do to you?" Rocco's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Jack thought he saw a flicker of something deep in them. A memory, a pain. Rocco's gaze was unwavering, but Jack couldn't help but feel that the dog was hiding something. Something more than the scars on his body. Something deeper. The next morning, Jack decided to find answers. He knew that the military wouldn't give him the truth about Rocco's past. They never had. But Jack wasn't just any soldier. He had earned his stripes, and he wasn't going to let them bury his questions. Not this time. Not about Rocco. He made his way to the records room, hoping to dig up anything that could shed light on Rocco's time after their separation. When he arrived, the clerk behind the desk gave him a suspicious look. She was a young woman, one of the new recruits, and she hadn't seen the kind of soldier Jack had become. Still, Jack had his ways. One call, a quick favor from an old friend, and the sealed envelope was in his hands. The papers inside were thick, well-worn, the ink fading in some places but still legible. There was a single photograph of Rocco, taken years after they had been separated. In the picture, Rocco looked thinner, his coat darker, his eyes harder. Standing beside him was a man Jack didn't recognize, tall, thin, with a vacant expression on his face. The man was dressed in civilian clothes, but it was the way he stood that unsettled Jack. Like he was guarding something, or perhaps being guarded. The documents that followed were more troubling. Medical notes, behavioral logs, and blacked-out sentences that only made Jack more anxious. But the worst part came in bold red ink. Subject exposed to extreme behavioral conditioning. Exposure linked to classified operations. Jack's hands trembled as he read the words. What had they done to Rocco? What kind of experiments had they run on him? The dog that had been his partner, his friend, the one who had kept him alive during the darkest times. Was it possible that he had been turned into something else? something they could control. His chest tightened as he turned the page, his mind racing. There were more notes, but one sentence stood out. Subject demonstrates acute reaction to the presence of former handler. May unlock suppressed data. Jack's blood ran cold. Suppressed data. What did that mean? And why was Rocco being used in such a way? The truth was worse than Jack had feared. Rocco hadn't just been reassigned. He had been subjected to some kind of behavioral conditioning. And what's worse, it was all part of something classified. The military had done something to Rocco, something Jack would never have agreed to. And now, it was too late to undo it. Suddenly, Jack felt a weight on his chest, a pressure that felt unbearable. The dog he loved, the one who had saved his life more times than he could count, had been used. He had been changed. But Jack wasn't ready to accept that. He wasn't ready to believe that Rocco had been turned into a weapon, a tool. Rocco had been through enough. He had been Jack's partner, his protector. And Jack wasn't about to let the military turn him into something else. He couldn't let that happen. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. His mind kept turning, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but leaving more questions behind. What had they done to Rocco? What kind of training had they put him through? And why had they kept it all hidden from him? The next morning, as Jack sat in his room, staring at the files spread out before him, he heard a noise. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to get his attention. He turned to find Rocco standing at the door, his body stiff and alert. The dog's eyes were fixed on something. Jack couldn't tell what. But there was something in Rocco's posture that made Jack's heart race. It wasn't just loyalty that kept Rocco by his side. It wasn't just the bond they shared. It was something else, something that Jack wasn't ready to face. Rocco growled low in his throat, his ears pinned back. Jack stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing. The dog had heard something. And Jack realized, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that the danger was closer than he thought. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. The days blurred together as Jack tried to make sense of the growing tension. Each time he looked at Rocco, the dog's eyes seemed to hold a deeper secret, one that Jack wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. They had always been a team, partners through thick and thin, bound by an unspoken understanding that no one else could truly comprehend. But now, after everything Jack had discovered, he felt the bond between them was being tested in ways he never imagined. The shadow of what the military had done to Rocco hung over them both like a thick cloud, suffocating any sense of peace they might have had. Jack had always known that war left its scars, but he hadn't realized how deeply those scars could run, into the very souls of those who had fought. Rocco had been more than a companion. He had been Jack's lifeline. But now, as Jack watched Rocco pace restlessly in the corner of their shared room, he wondered how much of the dog he once knew was still there. They weren't alone in this. Jack could feel it. Eyes were on them, always on them. The military had never been one to let go of its possessions easily, and Rocco was a weapon. A highly trained soldier, turned into something much darker than anyone could have imagined. But Jack wasn't just going to let Rocco be a casualty of their cruel experiments. The bond they shared was too strong for that. And now, Jack was about to take a stand. That night, Jack sat at his desk, his hands resting on the files he had been poring over for days. The more he read, the more questions piled up. There were references to behavioral conditioning, trigger responses, and terms like psychological manipulation. These weren't the words of medical professionals trying to help an injured animal. They were the words of people who treated living creatures as lab rats. And somewhere, deep within those documents, was the truth that would either save or destroy them both. Rocco's sudden growl startled Jack from his thoughts. The dog was standing by the window, his body tense, his ears perked. Jack knew that look. Rocco wasn't growling at nothing. He was alert. Something was wrong. Jack quickly stood up, his heart racing. He moved toward the window, But before he could see what had caught Rocco's attention, there was a knock at the door. "Jack, you in there?" It was Major Chris Thompson, Jack's former commanding officer. The man's voice was low, tense. Jack could feel the unease in the air. Thompson had always been a by-the-book kind of guy, but there was something in his tone that told Jack this wasn't just a routine check-in. "Yeah, come in," Jack called, trying to mask the suspicion that was growing inside him. The door opened slowly, and Thompson stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on Rocco, who was still on edge. "You might want to sit down for this," Thompson said, his words measured. Jack could see that the major wasn't his usual calm self. Something had changed. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thompson closed the door behind him and lowered his voice. "They know, Jack. They know what you're digging into. The files, the truth. They're coming for you. For Rocco. They don't want this getting out." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected something was off, but hearing it from Thompson confirmed his worst fears. "What do you mean?" "They can't." "They already are," Thompson interrupted, his voice grim. "They've got people inside. And they're moving fast. We need to get Rocco out of here. Now." Jack felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. He had been expecting something like this. The military wouldn't just let him walk away with the truth. But he wasn't about to let them take Rocco, not after everything they had been through together. "Where do we go?" Jack asked, his mind racing as he grabbed his jacket from the chair. Rocco was still on edge, his growl deepening as if he could sense the imminent danger. "There's a safe house," Thompson said, "but it's not going to be easy to get to. We're talking about people who don't just want to erase the truth. They want to erase you. Both of you." The weight of the situation hit Jack like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about protecting Rocco anymore. It was about survival. And as much as he hated it, he knew that he had no choice but to follow Thompson's lead. They had to move quickly. They had to get out before the military could get to them first. As they made their way out of the building, Jack's thoughts raced. He couldn't stop thinking about Rocco, about the dog who had been his constant companion, his protector. What had they done to him? What kind of tests had they subjected him to? And more importantly, how much of Rocco's true self was left? Rocco's behavior had been strange ever since their reunion. He was still loyal, still protective, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Jack saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Something guarded, something that didn't belong to the dog Jack had known. They reached the edge of the compound, the moonlight casting long shadows across the dirt road. Jack could hear the hum of helicopters in the distance, their searchlights sweeping the horizon. They weren't just looking for a soldier and his dog. They were looking for a threat, and they were closing in. "We need to move faster," Thompson said, his voice sharp. "They're already on their way." Jack nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. They had come too far. As they ducked behind a series of crates, Jack's mind flashed back to the days when he and Rocco had been inseparable. The long nights in the desert, the feeling of Rocco's warm body pressed against his in the cold, the bond that had kept them both alive. That bond was still there, still unbroken, but it was different now. The world had changed, and they weren't the same. The sound of boots crunching on gravel brought Jack back to the present. He turned to Rocco, who was standing still, alert, his body tense. The dog was ready, but Jack wasn't sure if they were ready for what was coming. "Stay close, boy," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. Rocco's tail flicked once, then he moved silently by Jack's side, every step in sync with his. They had to make it to this safe house. They had to survive. But the truth was, neither of them knew if they would make it out alive. The night pressed in on them as they made their way deeper into the shadows of the surrounding woods. The air was thick with tension. the scent of pine and damp earth mixing with the faint hum of helicopters hovering above. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't dare to slow his pace. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. Rocco moved beside him, his steps light but precise. The dog had always been a master at moving through difficult terrain, and Jack was grateful for that now. Every so often, Jack would glance over at Rocco, his loyal companion, but there was something in the dog's posture that unsettled him. Rocco's usual confident demeanor had shifted. He was no longer the playful, carefree dog that had once greeted him with exuberant joy. Now he was more like a soldier on edge, always watching, always listening for danger. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Rocco was carrying more than just the weight of their past. There was something heavier now, something buried deep within the dog's mind, something that Jack wasn't fully prepared to confront. The sound of helicopters above grew louder, their searchlights slicing through the dark, casting eerie shadows across the trees. The enemy was closing in, but Jack had learned long ago that fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. He had survived too many close calls to be caught off guard now. Every instinct, every training session, every experience had brought him to this moment. He couldn't fail. Not now. Not when Rocco was depending on him. They reached the edge of the woods and crouched down behind a fallen log. Jack held his breath, waiting for the sounds of the helicopters to fade. It was quiet for a moment, but then he heard it. The faint sound of boots crunching on the gravel. The soldiers were getting closer. "We're running out of time," Thompson whispered, his voice low but urgent. "We need to move fast." Jack nodded, his hand reaching out to Rocco's collar. The dog's eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, Jack saw something in them that sent a chill down his spine. There was recognition, yes, but there was also something else. A deep understanding of the danger they were in. It wasn't just the military they had to worry about. It was what had been done to Rocco. Whatever experiments, whatever conditioning they had subjected him to, it was still there, lurking in the dog's mind. Jack wasn't sure how much Rocco remembered or how much of what he had been turned into remained. But one thing was clear. Rocco was more than just a loyal companion. He had been shaped into something else. Something dangerous. "We have to trust each other," Jack muttered, more to himself than to Thompson. "We've always trusted each other." Thompson gave him a hard look. "This isn't the same, Jack. We're not just running from the past anymore. We're running from a future that wants to erase us both." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He already knew. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the truth. With one last glance toward the edge of the woods, Jack signaled to Rocco. The dog's body went still for a moment. Then he moved, fluid and silent, following Jack's lead as they crept toward the old road that would take them to the safe house. But even as they moved, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. He glanced over his shoulder every few seconds, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The trees seemed to close in around them as they pushed forward. The silence was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. They moved quickly, but Jack could feel the tension building with every step. The world outside the woods felt miles away, but Jack knew it wasn't enough. They weren't far enough yet. They needed to get to the safe house where they could regroup and figure out their next move. But even as he focused on the path ahead, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of the past bearing down on him. What had they done to Rocco? What kind of experiments had he been subjected to? Jack had read the documents, but there were still so many questions. The military had taken Rocco and turned him into something else. They had twisted his mind, conditioned him to obey commands that Jack wasn't sure he could control anymore. It was the thought of that, of losing Rocco to whatever had been done to him, that kept Jack moving. He couldn't let it happen. He couldn't lose Rocco again. As they neared the old farmhouse that would shelter them for the night, Jack's instincts kicked into high gear. He knew they were close, too close. The sound of helicopter blades was deafening now, and the searchlights were sweeping the ground, closer than ever. They had to make it to the house, and they had to do it quietly. Jack gave Rocco a final, determined look. The dog's eyes were sharp, and he moved with the same fluid grace he always had. But now, there was something darker in his movements, something Jack couldn't ignore. The moment they reached the farmhouse, Jack pushed open the door slowly, careful not to make any noise. The interior was dark and cold, but it offered shelter. For the time being, it was safe. They had made it. As Jack closed the door behind him, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. But even in the silence of the house, the weight of what was happening still pressed down on him. He couldn't stop thinking about the files, the conditioning, the experiments that had been done to Rocco. The dog he had once trusted with his life. The dog who had saved him, over and over again. Rocco sat near the door, his head tilted slightly, his body tense. Jack didn't know if the dog was hearing something, sensing something he couldn't, but there was a look in Rocco's eyes that Jack had never seen before. It was a mixture of awareness and fear, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Rocco was guarding something more than just the room. He was guarding the truth. And that truth was something neither of them was ready to face.